right. It's nice for Marty to get us back on time. Okay. The final speaker for today is Richard Bank. He is the founder and director of the Sustainable Supply Chain Foundation in Washington, D.C. And he has worked for several years with the State Department as a diplomat and as well as representing the U.S. in several United Nations agencies. And he will, the final talk will be, you have half an hour.
Oh, I've got a half an hour. Okay. I will thank you for the short presentation. It gives me some time. It's interesting, as I said, to hear others speak. And when Vital and I spoke months ago about this, I asked whether I should have a PowerPoint. And I have PowerPoints whenever I speak. He said, you don't need it this time. So I'm the one without the PowerPoint. So you've got to listen and not read. So that may help. A little bit about my background. It's interesting. I started out as I'm a lawyer, by the way. And it's always kind of fun when I work with engineers and PhDs that I'm often the only non-PhD or not non-professor or non-engineer. I work with NIST a lot, and they get a great charge out of having me as their, shall we say, as their object of scorn. And but I had my training as a lawyer, and then I went into the State Department, and I got into this industry because I ended up as Director of Maritime Affairs at State as a policy issue, and Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Transportation that dealt with aviation policy and shipping policy. And when you think about it, international relations are a mosaic, and economics is the biggest part of the mosaic. The only thing between countries other than war and sending dance troops back and forth is economics. And so, and then within that, shipping and aviation are very important. And shipping itself is an industry which is fascinating because it's an industry in itself, and it's also a facilitator of trade. So the dynamics of protectionism plus internationalism make it a very, very fascinating aspect. Anyway, from there I went into the private practice of law, primarily dealing on international transportation and trade. I've often spoken at a lot of fora, and I was asked about 6 years ago if I could participate at the I for Transport Sustainable Supply Chain Summit. And of course I said yes, whatever it was, and then they asked me to chair it, and I ended up chairing it for a number of years. And I've been involved in sustainable supply chain for the last 5 or 6 years. Going to those conferences and chairing those conferences, I realized that there was a certain element missing, and that's what the Sustainable Supply Chain Foundation is. And I'll give you an idea of what it is. We are a neutral third-party verifier of sustainability programs. We work with companies and institutions in order to assist them to create sustainable practices. We do this both through research, identifying best practices, work on their assessments, work with metrics and standards for them, and we're non-governmental in the way that, for example, SmartWay is and other governmental-based institutions. I'm very active in the CSCMP, Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and I guess the meeting coming up next week will be the first one I'll miss in about 10 years, but I have other things to do. But that is background. I've been asked to talk about a much more, or shall we say, a practical aspect of sustainability in the supply chain. And the supply chain that I speak to, and which others have spoken to, I think in the correct sense for this discussion, is the transportation and distribution aspect of supply chain. You'll hear the term supply chain used in regard to manufacturers. In other words, my suppliers back along the chain. So Walmart is concerned that the manufacturer of the sneakers that they sell, and they talk about that as their supply chain. But we speak about the logistics aspect of supply chain. And in fact, a sustainable supply chain, I have a note here that I said, what is a sustainable supply chain? Well, that's the integration of environmentally and financially viable practices into the complete supply chain life cycle. Each product has a life cycle, from the extraction of the raw material to the disposal at the end of the day. So that could be the product design and development, material selection, including the extraction of materials, manufacturing, packaging, and then the important aspect, and every step along the way, transportation, warehousing, distribution. Then we have consumption, and finally have we return or disposal. And that can also include recycling, which is another aspect of sustainability in the supply chain. So we're here talking about primarily transportation, warehousing, and distribution. And so the topic was warehouse energy savings and why sustainability. Well, we've heard a lot about different aspects of why people want sustainability. What are the key drivers? What are the incentives? It used to be, and I have a slide that I don't have here today, but I have a slide. I can show you a picture if you want to. I brought it with me. It shows somebody hugging a tree. Well, that was the old sustainable driver. Now we have somebody hugging a dollar sign because sustainability, especially in the energy side of things, is saving money. So the drivers go hand in hand. As you said, they're parallel now, and there's no better incentive in business than the driver of reduced cost and increased profit. So it'd be nice to be good corporate citizen, good world citizen, but in fact, when you can do that, be good and do good at the same time and make a better product or better sale, it's a lot better. So what will we have here? What are the incentives? What are the key drivers? We have to save money, and then I'll speak to you about a very important aspect of that, and that's the ROI, return on investment. It was alluded to earlier in the day. How much does it cost, but how much will I save? And the important aspect, how long will it take before I start saving money? Who's going to finance it up front, and who's going to benefit as it goes along? Whether it's the changing from incandescent to fluorescent to LED lighting. What will LED lighting in a warehouse mean? And I'll speak about it in terms of warehouses. What are the other incentives? Customers are now requiring sustainability throughout their supply chain. They want to tell who? They want to tell their own customers, the public. They want to tell their investors. Wall Street is now requiring this for a lot of the companies, that they be sustainable. Employees want to be part of a company which is sustainable, that have sustainability practices. Not only employees, but potential hires. You go to universities now and you try to recruit. They will ask you the question, what are you doing in the area of sustainability or green? Going back to this whole aspect of transportation and distribution and manufacturing, because we're moving, I'll show you where transportation or warehousing is part of manufacturing. You have this entire aspect of how green is your supply chain. When you think about it, when you think about carbon emissions, when you talk about greenhouse gases, I'd like you to all think about what might be the percentage of greenhouse gases between manufacturing and the transportation distribution side, depending upon the product. On our website, we quote the guy who heads up Stonyfield Farms, the yogurt company, and he states that only 18% is in manufacturing. The rest of it is in his transportation and distribution and his warehousing. Refrigeration, moving by trucks, et cetera. So it's not just manufacturing. You know, it used to be, and I used to have a couple of items that I used to hold up. So you have a product, whatever the product happens to be. And people used to think about sustainability in terms of whether it is recyclable or is it made out of recyclable material. But now, not how it gets there. In fact, I have to give Penn State a salute. And I didn't bring it with me. At Penn State, which most of you know, has a great conference center. And within the great conference center, there's a room for the coffee and the snacks and everything else with automatic machines and, you know, people behind the scenes filling your cups. And I took the cup, and it's an environmental cup. And it's a green cup, and it's a beautiful cup, and it has leaves on it. It says this is all made out of recycled material. That's beautiful. But how does it get there? How does it get manufactured? How much of that final product arriving at State College, what is the carbon footprint for that? Not in its manufacture, not in its beautiful shape or its disposability or the fact that it can be put into recycled landfill, but how does it move? So we have the public, so we have the potential hires, and we've got the public. And we've gotten to the point in this society that sustainability is part of every company's needs. Okay, we're talking about warehouses in particular. And warehouses are interesting because they are not just buildings in which goods come in and goods go out. We see more and more today that warehouses have other functions as well. There's pick and pack, there's semi-manufacture, there's assembly. There are activities which replicate or in fact mirror that which goes on in the industrial enterprise, on the shop floor as it were. So as you measure sustainability through energy use or energy saving in a warehouse, you've got two elements. You've got the building itself, as any building could save money or save energy. and I'll speak about a program we did for the warehouse industry. And you have what goes on in the building, the activities within the building. So the building itself as a structure, we'll talk about. So it's a key part of transportation distribution. So warehouses are important, and I noticed there was a discussion about urban environments as well. And I spoke at a conference for Agrion in New York a year ago, February, on the aspect of urban warehousing and urban distribution. How close do you put your distribution center to the urban environment? How close can you do it based upon the rising cost of city real estate? And then how you have to balance that with the transportation elements, the time elements, the labor aspects of in a large city. This all goes into the better supply chain. And supply chains are changing. Supply chains and the use of the warehouse may diminish based upon how much inventory you keep and the push-pull aspects of the changes of it, and also the resiliency of supply chains. You know, when you talk about resiliency of supply chains and supply chain issues, which speak to often great disruptions in supply chain. It used to be that things like tsunamis or natural events or earthquakes, they can affect supply chain in a large extent. But now the greatest seismic factor in supply chain is the consumer. The consumer is the driving force because of, shall we say, transparency and desire in regard to products. Products are now actually pulled. There's very few pushes, as you mentioned before, but the changing nature of fashion, for example, or electronics. It used to be that perishability only existed in the fruit and vegetable industry. Perishability is in the electronics industry. And if you don't have a supply chain designed to have that iPhone 6 in its marketplace at the time of the announcement, because iPhone 7 or Samsung is going to come next with its, you cannot operate in any industry. And therefore, warehouses are affected in that as well. Professor White spoke also of the two aspects of warehousing and transportations. One is the 3PL industry, third-party logistics providers, and the second are proprietary providers, both warehousing and trucking. The interesting thing about 3PLs is that the 3PLs do far more than just arrange transportation. They could be asset-based 3PLs. They can own their own warehouses. They can own their own trucks, their own fleet of airplanes, et cetera. Or they could be non-asset-based and simply arrange for transportation. But what's interesting about 3PLs is they do a lot more than arrange for transportation. My first introduction to that was about 10 years ago when I was, I guess, at a CSEMP meeting, where I was introduced to a guy, and what they had done, they were engaged by Sprint not only to move cell tower material, but to arrange for its construction. And taken to another degree, Windows, well, not Windows, but Apple. Apple is basically a research and development company and a marketing company. Everything else is outsourced. Everything is outsourced via a 3PL. 3PLs can source material from computers to shirts, to the buttons for the shirts. Everything is based upon their ability to gather all the material plus how it gets there. And so you'll have this now. We spoke before about globalization of all industries. I've given talks at a number of universities on my own, shall we say, experience in this industry, coming from my State Department days through legal, and I sat on boards of companies. And there are a number of factors which have changed that. And the interesting part of it is that you've seen tariffs reduced and the trade across borders change. You've seen technological changes, the containerization. I hate to say this, but I started in the shipping industry before there was containerization. Containerization came through Sealand in the early 70s. I was Director of Maritime Affairs at the State Department in 73. I started in 1974. There was different rates for containerized cargo as opposed to break bulk vessels, like the break bulk vessel that you showed. And so between technological changes, trade relationships, treaties, both bilateral treaties and multilateral treaties, which broke down the borders, you now can source all over. And what does that mean for this industry? And what does it mean for sustainability in this industry? Every step along the way, it could be more sustainable. And companies will want their supply chain partners, third-party providers, to be sustainable. So let's go back to those warehouses again. So most of you know the names of major manufacturers and retailers, whether they be Procter & Gamble as a manufacturer or Walmart as a retailer. But few can even mention 1, 2, or 3 third-party warehouse providers. And those are, they could be mom and pops in a region, they could be a couple of $1 million worth of industry. And I'll give you an example of one of the companies that works very well. But these are the ones who are hired by these household name retailers or manufacturers. And they are now being required by their customers to be more sustainable. The RFPs, the requests for proposals that come down to these companies, let's say Procter & Gamble's or Unilever, will go to mom and pop in Dallas, Texas, who has a nice big warehouse you've never heard of, I've never heard of, but they're the ones that do the distribution, and they also package the mustard, the ketchup, and the relish together, and that's in their semi-manufacturing aspect, so that goes out on July 4th, or for July 4th. They want them to show what they do for sustainability. What we, by the way, the foundation has done is worked with a number of warehouse associations, and we created what was called the Sustainable Logistics Initiative, where we assist organizations like umbrella groups to create sustainability programs which their members can do. And there's okay. So we have those mom and pops. We have the other question is, in warehouses, who controls the installation of new plant and equipment, lighting, heating, et cetera? Are the owners and the lessors, or is it the lessees? This is a major issue which is in the industry. Now, warehouse customers are the ones, as I said, who want to have the world know that they have sustainable supply chain. And so the key is the energy savings and as the driver of the balance sheet. Let me give you a good example of the problems of ROI and the return on investment. And the one that I give in discussing both the building and the operations is a company in Minneapolis run by the Murphy family. Richard Murphy is a brilliant guy, a good friend of mine. He's been on the board of WERC, the Warehouse Educational Research Council, CSCMP. And Murphy Warehouse is a 4th generation company. In fact, they have a horse and drayage symbol on their cards. But Richard's a PhD in environmental affairs and landscaping from Harvard, but still runs this company. Richard has done tremendous things. For example, around his warehouses, he has no lawns. He has prairie grass. And treating it, just having a natural grass instead of having treated, over 14 years, he saved $950,000 just for not watering and not taking care of it. And the neighbors who see these trucks come in and out say, "Oh yeah, you're the guy with the flowers and the trees instead of the lawns." But Murphy gave me a better example, a more important example when it comes to ROI. Murphy is a company run by Richard and his cousins, and he's very active in the Minneapolis community. He knows a lot of people, especially with General Mills and 3M and the other major companies. And he's shifted all his 6 or 7 warehouses to LED lighting, for example, and has probably the leading edge activities. And he knows more about solar, and he knows more about wind, and knows more about the way to do things in the various, shall we say, pure environmental areas in regard to energy, water use, recycling, than almost anybody. And he goes to these guys at these other major companies and says, "Why don't you guys do this as well?" He's a great advocate of this. He says, "We just can't do it." And he says, "Why?" "Well, the ROI is too long, the return on investment, and Wall Street is demanding our results every 6 months, every 1 year, and if we start investing in things that take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they'll kill us. We can't do it." So here, in a strange sense, many large companies do not do what some small companies can do. Speaking of ROI, one of the members of my board and a former law partner of mine, and this is what an earlier speaker spoke about this afternoon. The question is, how do you finance? How do you retrofit? Obviously, you have you can build new warehouses, but a lot of warehouses are existing. How do you retrofit them to be sustainable? Well, there are sustainability programs that are available, and there are a lot of programs which allow the owner of the warehouse not to put upfront money. They are financed. There are government, both state and federal government incentives. And the financing programs can be done in a way in which the owner does not put up any money ahead of time. But it is the lender, is the financer who starts to reap the benefits, and only after he returns, gets his money back, does the owner really achieve the savings. But the incentive is there to do it. In fact, there are a number of companies and a number of lawyer groups that have done it. Mike Cavanaugh with Holland and Knight, who's my old friend and sits on my board, he's done it for the Empire State Building, Daly Center, and a lot of other large buildings where they're retrofitted to become environmentally, shall we say, more sustainable, and they are energy efficient. So this can happen in warehouses as well. There's a company in Southern California called the Dependables Company, and they have warehouses, and warehouses are wonderful, by the way, for solar, because they're flat roofed, and they, especially in Southern California, fantastic. So the warehouse company, the Mossman Brothers, who run that company, they installed solar, and under California law, they sell back a significant portion of their energy to the grid. And they've been making a profit from day 10 on this thing, and it just took a little bit of foresight and a little bit of imagination to do it. You know, the storytelling aspect is a great aspect of what things can be done. As I said, I chaired the Sustainable Supply Chain Summits for a couple of years. And you hear some wonderful stories about companies that you don't expect to look to sustainability, have learned how important it is, and do it for savings. Going to your cans. I've got another can story that is that's almost as good. And this was given by a guy who was big and strong and with a long Polish name, who was an executive with U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh, California. There is a Pittsburgh, California. And they produce steel there. They don't have the smoke steel, but they do the milling and the other aspects and the rolling and create. One of the things they do create, and one of the things they do is tin plate to make cans. And cans that they sell go south to Southern California for Del Monte and other canners of fruits in California. And he said that they took a look at what they were doing on moving these big spools of stainless steel. So they used to have 2 on a flatbed. They went to 3 on a flatbed. Okay. They took away half of the cab because they only used 1 driver anyway. They used more rail, no left turns, and they ended up saving $400,000 a quarter just by being energy efficient. And this was a great story. Another story that came, which you wouldn't think at all, from British Telecom. British Telecom has a big facility in Western Virginia, lots of computers. Well, how do they save? Well, they have these rooms that are temperature controlled. And you have this in warehouses as well, both for what's called dry, and also for cold storage. And you usually have specifications that are set by manufacturers on what the specs should be. So British Telecom goes back to the manufacturer of the computers, which said that originally that they should be this. It shouldn't be colder than this and shouldn't be warmer than this, and therefore they're climate control. They went back and they had recalculated the specs, and they could be like this. So there they saved a fortune on their energy costs on that. And it happens in warehouses as well. So there's always a new way of doing things. You mentioned Conway. Conway, I know Conway very well. Keith Kennedy, who's the chairman of the board, was at Cornell with me, and his wife was the wife.
He used to be chair.
Yeah, he was a former chair, and I've dealt with them. And they have a young guy by the name of Ashton Shaw, whose job alone is environmental issues. This is a company that has looked to it, and they've done a very good job in what they've done. There are a lot that can be done in this industry, and the drivers, as I said, are both the, shall we say, the good feeling of being a good citizen, and the other aspect of it being the money. Let me just make two or three other points. There are umbrella organizations which, in the industry, 3PL industry, such as IWLA, International Warehouse Logistics Association, work which I mentioned, the NITL, National Transportation League, and others, which can be the basis of educating their membership, especially the smaller companies. You mentioned UPS. I deal with them a lot. They're great people, and they have that wherewithal to do what they want to do. Smaller companies just can't do that. Can't do that in the same way. So their umbrella organizations can assist them in that. They can exchange best practices. They can get organizational publicity. This is what we've done with the Warehouse Association. You create a certificate or a verification which they can put on their RFPs, on their stationery, and say, look, we have a program. It may be a basic program. The program we had with the warehouses was a very basic one. We created certain metrics, certain basic standards. They started with, just with their utility bills, and you have a base, and show them how they can reduce their utility bills and We had four environmental, or should we say, hard sustainability areas. We had electric use or natural gas. We had water usage. We had recyclable, and we had the use of propane or other accelerants in regard to material handling within the warehouse. And we had two social sustainability. That's another area, social sustainability. One had to do with worker safety, and the other had to do with community service. So we assisted them in working out these programs. But these organizations can do it. So dovetailing into what my last item I was going to discuss, and that is government and academic institutions, and what can they do to help? Well, I mentioned before that I've been working with NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and I guess it's through NIST and former students and former Penn State guys who I know at NIST introduced me to this group. There must be metrics and standards. By creating standards and metrics, you can measure, and by measuring, you can get to the next step and to the next step. And to work with academic institutions like Penn State or others, to work with NIST or other government organizations, not to create regulations per se, but to assist in creating these standards. In this way, the warehouse, which is an arm, as I said, of manufacturing, can become much more efficient, making industry in the United States more competitive. So we see it in the EPA Smart Way, which was mentioned. That has been a terrific program, one of the best programs ever devised, and it's never seen by the trucking industry, for example, as a government regulatory type of thing. It is so well received. And it dovetails with CSCMP, for example. There's a Smart Way Award every year that's given at CSCMP. And then we learn from international organizations as well. We should look abroad to see what others are doing. Europe, in some ways, is a little bit ahead of us in some issues, but they are in a much more EU-oriented regulatory sense. I've worked a lot with the EU for my State Department days and my legal days, and I have a very cynical approach. Brussels tries to create work for Brussels, and this is one of the reasons why you see it, but there's a lot to be learned from that. And then finally, university studies. And a lot of the studies that come out of a lot of the university programs are excellent studies. They may not be practical in their first step, but they lead business into the next steps, which then become practical, money-saving, and very beneficial. And these can be very, very, very helpful. So, and the other thing that universities can do, and in fact it's another arm of Penn State, for example, or in Georgia Tech with good supply chain programs, is that we're now producing a cadre of supply chain university graduates who understand a lot of these issues from day one. The day of the traffic manager becoming a supply chain logistics expert has changed. Newer graduates learn these issues. I've spoken to, I do a lot of work with Maryland, the University of Maryland on this, that you have this group of students who become the new leadership in many companies in the logistics field, in the warehousing field, in the transportation field, who understand how important sustainability is. One last story, which I thought I was going to mention to you before, and that has to do with a company that's called Saddle Creek in Lakeland, Florida. They use CNG, compressed natural gas, on their new trucks. And there used to be an old saying that, well, you can't use CNG because unless you have a gas station from coast to coast, it can't work. But as UPS does in some of its routes, so does Saddle Creek do, and they have their stations in their route, and it's a southeastern route, and the trucks can get service that way, and they find the CNG, especially as opposed to diesel or regular gasoline, is a much more efficient way of doing it. But it was a unique solution. They realized that they were different than the cross-country haulers. They had a unique, shall we say, they had a regular route for their trucks, so they could try CNG. And I think about 60 or 70% of their trucks now are CNG over the last few years. Anyway, those are a couple of my thoughts, and the concepts are that basically, whether it's a third-party logistics provider in the warehouse space or whether it's a proprietary one in the warehouse space, the box itself, the building itself can be made more efficient and therefore more sustainable and therefore much more profitable, and so can the operations within the warehouse. So when you think of the supply chain, you think of the creation of the product, but every step along the way, from the extraction of raw material to its disposal, you've got the transportation distribution element, and that is the chain we're talking about. And during that chain, or within that chain, we can reduce energy use and make it more efficient. I guess I'll take questions with everybody else.